Hey there! Today Rivian finally announced more details about the pricing and the options on the R2. And the question is, should you buy one? Today at South by Southwest, Rivian dropped a whole bunch of details that we've been waiting for on the R2. We've got trim levels, we've got colors, we've got tech options that personally I'm very excited about. We've got pricing. So I'm gonna go over real quick, just a brief overview of what they talked about. I'm gonna go over a couple of things that I think were notable that we learned today about the R2. And then I'm gonna finish up with whether I think you should buy the R2 or not. So just a quick overview of what they announced. We've got three different trim levels of the R2. We've got the basic, we've got the premium, and we've got the performance. The performance is what they're gonna launch with, priced at $58,000. There's going to be a premium variant that's like still nice, but it's not the fast one. That's coming later this year, and that one's going to start at $53,000. And there's a $48,000 basic one that you can actually get starting next year, and end of next year, they're going to have the $45,000 basic with just a really small battery. That's the poopy trim, so to speak. But honestly, at the price levels it's at and what it offers, it looks like a very compelling package. So let me go over real quick some of the interesting things that I learned about the R2 today. I highly recommend you go watch a video by Jose from Rivian Tracker. I'll link it down below. He had a conversation with Wasim talking about a lot of the tech and the software, which is what I'm very interested in. So I highly recommend you go check out his stuff. But I just kind of wanted to give a follow-up to the video that I made yesterday where we were pixel peeping on the prototypes. And we learned a lot of really cool stuff that's coming with the tech. So if you want to check that out, I'll have that linked right here and you can go watch that. But just as a follow-up to that, if you watched that video, you may have seen that I noticed a little weather widget on the sidebar, and that little sidebar we learned is called a fish stick. So that's actually kind of hilarious. But it turns out there's a whole weather app that goes with that weather widget. So that's kind of fun. I've got on my laptop here a couple of notes of different things that I noticed today that are kind of interesting. So the first one was the fish stick and the weather app. Very cool. We learned that there's going to be more media sources coming, potentially Apple Podcasts. I really hope that YouTube Music is in there. We don't know specifically what they are, but more media sources are coming in Rivian OS 2. Rivian OS 2, by the way, we have learned is also coming to existing R1 vehicles later this year. So that will be nice. One of the big ones that I did mention in yesterday's video as well is the magnetic charger. It's not a MagSafe branded charger, but that'll work with iPhones that have MagSafe. It'll work with Pixel phones. The Pixel 10 has MagSafe or a magnetic charger built in, and any Android phones that just have the magnetic case. That is a huge win for usability on that charging pad. That's fantastic. Okay, another one that I wanted to talk about that I noticed is conserve mode is available across all R2 models. And that's really interesting because as of right now with the R1, conserve mode is kind of inconsistent and it only exists on the upper trim levels of the R1. Basically what it does is it just puts the vehicle into two-wheel drive when you're cruising at a constant speed and all-wheel drive when you need the extra power. That's all fine and good. But what's interesting to me is that it's showing conserve mode on the basic trim of the R2. Now, the basic trim is being advertised as a two-wheel drive trim level. Technically speaking, if you look at the fine print, there is an all-wheel drive variant of the basic trim level, but the one that they're talking about, the one that has the pricing on it, the one that they're advertising is the two-wheel drive version of the basic. So that begs the question, when they have conserve mode, which is like a part-time all-wheel drive on a two-wheel drive vehicle, does that mean that that conserve mode does something different? Does that mean that conserve mode is adding more functionality for the R2? You know, I could see it doing things like, for example, limiting the amount of power that you have, or maybe limiting climate control performance so that you can eke a little bit of extra range out of the battery. That would be cool if they changed conserve mode to do something like that. It could be that, or it could just be that the conserve mode that they're referring to on the basic trim only applies if you get the all-wheel drive basic trim. We're definitely getting into the weeds there. We'll have to find out more what that means as we get closer, but kind of an interesting note. Another interesting thing that we learned is actually about the R1. So one feature that has been very widely requested for the R1 with pet mode is a pet cabin camera access. As it stands right now in the Rivian app, when the vehicle is parked, you can access the cameras all around the vehicle and you can get sort of a live view of what's happening around the vehicle, but you can't access the inside cameras when you have pet mode turned on like you can with Tesla. And we finally learned why that is. It's because the camera that's in the rear view mirror of the R1 is not a full color camera. It's just an infrared camera that's basically like the bare minimum amount of camera that you need to monitor if a driver is watching the road or not. But in the R2, this camera is a full RGB camera that lets you see basically the entire cabin in full color, something that actually looks like a decent image. So they are planning on introducing a pet cabin camera for the R2. Also, interesting to note here, you may recall in my previous coverage that the R2 is launching with the same autonomy hardware that the R1 Gen 2 has. The cameras are slightly upgraded with better low light and better dynamic range, but the resolutions are the same. However, there was 10 extra megapixels of resolution for one of the cameras that seemed to be upgraded. My prediction, my thought was that it was the interior camera that they upgraded with the extra resolution. And now that we know that the interior camera is indeed different with full RGB, I feel quite confident in saying that the resolution of the cameras around the vehicle is the same in the R2. It's just the interior camera that is a higher resolution one now. And so that's kind of interesting. I'll come back to the whole autonomy hardware thing in just a minute because that is its own little topic, its own little rabbit hole. Okay, honestly, I could go on forever about the stuff that we learned about the R2 over the last couple of days, but I want to finish up for now with whether or not the R2 is worth getting. And the short answer is yes, it's a very compelling package. But there's a lot of different nuances to that question, what you're looking for out of it. And one of the big looming questions is especially with regards to autonomy and how the vehicle is going to improve over time. So as it stands right now, the R2 appears like this is how it's going to be for the foreseeable future, with one exception, and that is the LiDAR and the autonomy computer. And that's kind of a hard one. So Rivian announced at the end of last year that the R2 would be getting the Gen 3 autonomy package with that upgraded computer and LiDAR at the end of 2026. We'll see if that timeline holds up. It could be end of 2026. It could even be more towards the beginning of 2027. We honestly don't know yet. The Gen 3 autonomy wasn't mentioned at all today. And honestly, I feel like it's a little bit less of a factor, at least should be less of a factor than a lot of people are making it out to be. And I say that because the actual user experience of the Gen 3 autonomy hardware isn't going to be very different for a long time. As it stands right now, the big motivator for Rivian to put LiDAR into all of these vehicles is less about the experience in that vehicle in particular, and more about just using that LiDAR to gather data that will help all vehicles. Because the truth of the matter is that the Rivian autonomy software is improving very quickly, even now as it stands. And when the LiDAR equipped vehicles start hitting the road, at the end of this year or maybe even early next year, so it could be even a year from now that that's happening, all of the data that they collect from those vehicles is initially just going to benefit all vehicles with the Gen 2 hardware. That's R1 Gen 2, and that's all of the R2s that are going to start shipping this year with Gen 2 hardware. It probably won't be until, you know, maybe 6 or 12 months after the LiDAR launches that we'll even start to see new capabilities with the R2 or with the Gen 3 hardware on R2. Because all vehicles, Gen 2 or Gen 3 equipped, will benefit from that learning. So, you know, realistically, we're looking at maybe like 2 years from now minimum that we're going to start to see a divergence in capability. Rivian has talked about hands-off, eyes-off functionality, but it sounds like they sort of have changed the timing of their roadmap. Instead, they're focusing first on their point-to-point self-driving system. And while there's no guarantees for this, we have seen that system functioning on a Gen 2 hardware-equipped vehicle. You know, and whether that software ends up coming out or not for Gen 2, we have no guarantee, but I'm reasonably confident that we'll see point-to-point self-driving. I think the difference with the Gen 3 hardware will be with hands-off, eyes-off. And, you know, again, that's at least a year, more likely 2 years away. So those are my thoughts. If you have a reservation for the R2 and you're thinking about maybe waiting for the Gen 3 hardware, it may not be as big of a difference for a long while as you think. You know, a lot of people will do 2 or 3 year leases with early R2. And by the time their lease is up in 2 or 3 years, that's when the fruits of R3 will actually be bearing themselves. And so the timing may work out for you to just get one now. That said, there are a lot of people that want R2. Who knows if Rivian's even going to be able to build them fast enough. So this may be a moot point anyway. As for me personally, I think I will likely be waiting for a Gen 3 equipped vehicle. And I know that's rich just because I said that the Gen 3 wouldn't make a huge difference. But the reason for me to wait for the Gen 3 hardware is I already have an R1S that has the Gen 2 hardware and presumably will be a very similar experience to the Gen 2 hardware in R2. So as much as I would love to have an R2 right away, it just makes more sense for me to wait for the Gen 3 because I have Gen 2 hardware already and I love my R1S. And in a lot of ways, as cool and exciting as the R2 is, and as much amazing new technologies they're putting into the R2, it's a cheaper vehicle than the R1 and it's going to be a downgrade in a lot of ways from the R1. So for now, I'm holding on to my R1, but that doesn't mean that the early build launch edition R2 is going to be a bad vehicle. I think it's really compelling. In either case, if you're interested in buying a Rivian and you feel like this was information that's helpful, use my referral code down below. You'll get free charging and you'll get some Rivian reward points, which is awesome. And like I said before, you should check out the video by Jose from Rivian Tracker. It's very cool to see some firsthand stuff from Wasim. But until the next one, thanks for watching.
Woo, we're in the weeds on this one, folks.
We're just gonna start over. Is it worth buying? Should I get in line for? I was noticing,
Man, how do I explain this without just getting too into the weeds?